Okay, open this public hearing. Topic is comprehensive plan and zone amendment, Riverfront connector plan, and I'm going to turn it over to our city planner, Jacob Greichen.
Thank you, Mayor.
Yep.
This is a public hearing, and this is a legislative land use hearing. The subject of this hearing are amendments to our code and our comprehensive plan, specifically adoption of the Riverfront connector plan as an addendum to our comprehensive plan, and some related code amendments to our development code and a little other parts of the municipal code as well. City of St. Helens is the applicant. Because legislative proceedings require the observance of certain procedural formalities, the council must take a few moments to cover some preliminary matters and required statements. So, does any member of the council wish to declare a conflict of interest or bias?
Opinion is considered bias or...
No, a bias if you're inclined to one side for some reason. I don't think an opinion on a project would be a bias, so thank you for the question. So with that, does anybody in the audience want to object to a council or to make a fair decision? Fantastic. So the rules and the conduct for the hearing are set forth in the handout on the table in the back of the room. Generally, the order will be as follows: required statements, which I'm doing currently, staff report, applicant's presentation, and then finally those in favor, those opposed, any rebuttal, close of the hearing, close of the record, deliberations, and decision. Following statements are to be made at the commencement of the hearing. The standards of the decision by the council shall be based on St. Helens Municipal Code 17.20.120, subsection 1, standards for legislative decision. And all testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed towards the standards listed or other criteria which the person believes applies. So, with that out of the way, we've been talking about this a long time. We've been working on this for a long time, and happy to be at this final stage. This is the adoption stage to the Riverfront connector. We've all had a lot of meetings on it. We have Matt Hasty here with the Angelo Planning Group to help us navigate this final process, and he's going to kind of lead us through how we've got to where we're at and what we're asking you to adopt.
All right. Thanks, Jacob, and thanks for having me here tonight. And I do have a PowerPoint, but it's pretty short. I will tell you, it's like 7 or 8 slides. The Planning Commission, I forgot to bring it for them, so they didn't even have to watch a PowerPoint when I came up in front of them. So, but you guys do, because I remembered it tonight. So just kind of starts out with quick, where are we in the process, which is at the end of the process, at the adoption stage. This just summarizes the steps we went through, drafted a set of project goals and a vision statement, summarized existing conditions in the corridor, some of the opportunities as well as some of the challenges. We went through a process of identifying a set of options for multiple segments within the corridor as well as specific intersections. There were some segments where we really just had kind of one recommended option, but others where we had 2 or 3 different options. Evaluated those against the criteria that we developed at the outset of the project, and then recommended some preferred options. In a number of cases, those evolved further, and we ended up with kind of a hybrid of a couple of different options that we looked at initially. And then those have all been described and compiled into the draft Riverfront connector plan, and then as sort of a companion piece, we identified proposed implementing policy and ordinance amendments. So I'll talk about those in a little bit here, but that's the process we've gone through. And it says spring up there, so we're still technically in spring. So we're pretty much stayed on track on this one in terms of the schedule. I think we're just maybe a month or so behind what we originally assumed. So just kind of a reminder of the project area. And this project area in this corridor were sort of defined really well before we got on board and in previous planning documents and processes, and essentially completes a business loop. A lot of you may know or remember that we prepared a similar corridor plan for US 30 and then the Columbia Boulevard, St. Helens Road corridor down into this area, and then this corridor essentially kind of completes that loop, goes from First Street through the waterfront refinement area of Plymouth, out Old Portland, and then up Gable to Highway 30 with kind of a secondary study area on Old Portland Road, south of Gable, as well as McNulty Way and Millard Road. So we didn't spend as much time or detail on that secondary project area, but it was something we looked at in terms of some of the intersections there and the proposed cross sections of the roadways. So since I think the last time we had a work session with you all, this was something we talked to the Planning Commission about as well. We did make a number of changes to the plan. We haven't made changes since the Planning Commission meetings, since they essentially recommended to forward it on to you for adoption, but we had a work session with you all prior to that, and we did make some changes after that work session. We made a number of changes to the text within the document just to reflect that it was a final document, and also to address some of the issues that people raised earlier in the process. We didn't make substantive changes to the design concepts, although we have prepared a graphic that identifies kind of an alternative cross-section design for the segment through the waterfront refinement plan area that assumes less right-of-way there. So that's something that will be an appendix to the plan and something the city can use in terms of having the ability to be flexible on that cross section depending on the amount of right-of-way ultimately available and used through that area. One of the concerns that came up in the process was just how people would safely access properties where they needed to cross corridor segments where we have sidewalks and cycle tracks. And so we provided some examples in an appendix to the plan that show how that's being done in some other places. Councilor Carlson had some good suggestions on places she's seen where that's done. So you'll see some graphics in that appendix of the plan and some sort of sketches that show how you can kind of do that in a safe manner. We also had a question about preparing cost estimates that actually had not been in a sort of part of our scope of work or our work plan, but the folks at Kittleson and Associates went ahead and did that anyway. So sort of kudos to them, I would say, for doing that. So we have a set of cost estimates for all of the corridor segments as well as the intersection improvements. They are what I would consider planning level cost estimates, but for planning level cost estimates, they're relatively detailed. They essentially include estimates for sort of each element of a corridor section, the paved travel lanes, the sidewalks, the bicycle lanes, the landscaping, and they use unit costs for those different elements, cost per lineal foot or mile, multiply them by the distance, and then provide a total cost. And it's kind of the same thing for the intersection improvements. They mapped out the area that would be paved, the area of sidewalks, of bike lanes, of roundabout features, et cetera, and came up with cost estimates for all of those. And they also included some essentially soft costs, design and construction management, as well as a contingency. And they tend to be fairly conservative on their contingencies because they'd rather overestimate than underestimate the cost. Rather have you have a sense of the cost that you don't go out and find, oh, actually it's going to cost a lot more. So I'll show you kind of a roll-up graphic of those costs, but that's another thing we would likely put in an appendix to the plan just as an informational piece. And then in terms of the draft code amendments, we had prepared a draft a while back, and then city staff took a good close look at that, and I think you have a copy that's got their markups in red. So once we get through this hearing, we would go back and then finalize all the documents, including making the changes to these amendments that city staff noted in the marked up copy. And then, I already noted that last graphic or that last bullet that I added this graphic or adding this graphic for that segment 2.1 section as well. So those are some of the updates to the plan based on some of the conversations we had with all of you in the Planning Commission previously. This is just, and so I'm not going to go through all the cross-section designs and all the intersection designs. I just kind of put this one up on the screen as an example of one of the segment cross-section designs and the types of graphics that you see in the plan. This is sort of the preferred design for the segment number 3, which is essentially along Plymouth Avenue. And so for each of those segments, we've got these kinds of graphics, and we've got information about sort of why we identified the preferred option that we identified, both for the segments as well as for the intersections. I put similarly, this is one of the intersection designs. We've actually got more detail on the design in the plan, but this is the roundabout where Old Portland Road and Plymouth come together. This was is the preferred design in the plan for that particular intersection. And these are the same things that you saw when we had the joint work session with the Planning Commission. And again, the designs in there really haven't changed much since then. It's more just some of the accompanying narrative and some additional information in the documents that were in response in a lot of cases to kind of what we heard from folks at the work session or at previous meetings. Wayfinding recommendations are just another aspect of the plan, so you'll see those kind of throughout the plan as well as a summary of those at the end of the document, and that's just the table that kind of summarizes all of those wayfinding suggestions, and they build on the wayfinding plan that the city did previously and assume use of the kind of signage that you'd already come up with. And what we did was go through and say, hey, at specific locations, these are the types of signage that you'd want to have and the content of the signs, and where they'd be located at a given intersection and what they'd be pointing towards. So it's another piece of the plan. This is that rolled up table of cost estimates. So this is the cost estimates for each of the intersections and each of the segments, and then we have more detailed figure numbers within that set of cost estimates that for each row or each line here you see we've got another whole table that goes with that shows you kind of how we arrived at those cost estimates in terms of amount of sidewalk, amount of paved street, amount of landscaping, etc. And as you can see here, I mentioned those kind of soft costs. You've got a 30% contingency, which is sort of hey, things can change, and so we want to make sure we've got some contingency in there, and then an engineering and construction management cost, and then all that adds up to the total estimated project cost. So these are some fairly big numbers. Probably won't be surprised about some of these. Some of these segments are fairly long, and they have a lot of elements to the street. So
Just to know that engineers and construction managers make a lot of money.
that's I think we probably assume somewhere on the order of 20 to 25%, and I would say anywhere between 15 and 25% is a pretty typical, it's a typical kind of rule of thumb. When you look at those, and we'll provide the cost estimates to you, when you look at those, you'll see that we include some assumptions about the range of percentages. And these are, again, kind of planning level cost estimates. And for these kind of cost estimates, we actually use kind of higher ranges because of the uncertainty, because of the sort of approximateness of the estimates. So engineering and construction management probably wouldn't cost that quite that much, probably would actually be a lower percentage. But yes, engineers and construction managers and designers, when you add up all their time, it's not a small piece of the cost there. Yeah,
it's not uncommon to see 30%. If you've got a lot of survey and sub-consultants and permitting, 30% is
you might have to
it's relatively common. So
you might have to do some natural resource evaluation, and there's all kinds of stuff that goes into those those kind of soft costs. And then just in terms of this implementation, I'll just note some specific things here. Again, I won't go through this in detail, but I'll note the types of changes to your comprehensive plan policies or development code or municipal code that we're talking about. So first, we're recommending some updates to your comprehensive plan policies as well as your transportation system plan and your development code that reference this document. And note that this document does provide guidance in terms of the design of roads in this area, and also clarifies that if there are differences between what this document says and what earlier planning documents say, this is the controlling document because it represents the more recent and more detailed designs for roadways in the area. So the policies just kind of clarify what kind of the controlling document is. We didn't really identify changes to zoning designations or to development standards. We weren't really focused on the development of the land adjacent to the road, and we had gone through your zoning code, your development code in that earlier corridor planning process to kind of look for those types of things that might support or affect the design and use of the road itself. So we'd kind of already gone through that process in the previous corridor planning process. So by the time we got to this one and we weren't proposing changes in the character or the nature of land use within the corridor or really design and development adjacent to it, we didn't identify specific changes to those aspects of your code. We did just note that you may need to update some of your landscape standards to ensure they're consistent with the connector plan and can be implemented. One of the things that we talked about with you previously and with staff is that you currently have a fee in lieu requirement that requires a fee in lieu for sidewalks adjacent to new development or properties that develop. And so we are proposing updating those fee in lieu requirements to address the full cost of the frontage of the actual road improvements. So they substitute the word frontage for sidewalks so that you're capturing the cost of not just a sidewalk, but also the other improvements to the road. Adjacent to the any property that gets developed along here. We also just note in those requirements that you have to make sure that when you're requiring that kind of fee or that kind of improvement, that you're not going sort of above and beyond the impact that would be or the cost that would be proportionate to the impact from that development. So that's kind of an important thing to note, so you don't get yourself in trouble by requiring more than what somebody should legally have to do or pay. And then finally, let's see, we just noted that ultimately these are conceptual designs, and if you move forward with any of these projects, there's going to be a more detailed design process, and there's going to be more opportunities to potentially refine things and work with property owners. So these are conceptual designs. There's a lot of work and detail that went into them, but they're not by any stretch sort of the final design for any of these projects. You just kind of look and see if there's anything else I want to be sure and mention. We did also, I'll mention a couple other things. We added some definitions to your development code, in part to address some of the discussion we had at the work session. So one of the comments we had was that you have a municipal code requirement that prohibits riding bicycles on sidewalks. Some of the facilities within this corridor are proposed to be shared use paths with bicycles and pedestrians sharing the pathway. Also, we use the term cycle track in the document, so we added definitions of those things to your development code to make sure that it's understood that those are meant to be shared or used by bicycles and pedestrians. And then also recommended an amendment to your municipal code to clarify that bicycles would be allowed to ride on those shared use pathways, that current requirement in your municipal code that says bikes and pedestrians can't be on a sidewalk together doesn't prevent people from being able to use those shared use paths in that way. So that's something you'll see kind of in red on the last page here. Did I miss anything, Jacob? Okay, so that's the code and the policy and code amendments piece of this, and that was my last slide. So I will be happy to answer any questions you might have. Just do my best to do that.
I've got a question on the last slide you had up there on implementation.
Yes.
And it looks like at last incorporated and redefined designs as a part of future detailed design processes. Looks like that's some built-in flexibility. Am I just guessing? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's generally correct. I mean, so we were again designing these things at a fairly conceptual level. We're identifying the size, the general size and width of different parts of the cross section. And for intersections, we've got a general intersection design. We tried to be, within that sort of conceptual level as specific as we could about locations. But for instance, we've had discussion about at some of the intersections, well, we wanted to avoid impacts to a certain property. That's the kind of thing that you can do during a detailed design process, kind of shift the location of the intersection improvements to avoid some of those impacts. You might have impacts on natural resources, and you might end up wanting to either move things a little bit or maybe shift some of the dimensions in terms of widths or whatever it might be to address things that we didn't have enough time and resources to identify during a process like this.
Okay,
So,
good.
short answer, yes. That
Yeah.
was the long
Well,
answer.
that's a very in-depth answer,
Yeah.
I think. So what I'm referring to specifically is segment 2.2,
Okay.
and in that area, I don't know if we can go back on some slides on I think it's about three
Yeah,
slides
we can
back,
back to
possibly.
the map.
Segment 2.2 is outlined in there somewhere.
Yep. Segment
Okay, so yeah, it's
2.2
over
is
there on the right.
yep,
It's a
coming around the
dogleg
curve.
turn.
Yep.
And case in point, we had some discussion on this, is brought up with Councilor Topaz especially, that there's now a sinkhole, or there was a sinkhole in that area that we got a report on today from our engineer that it is repaired, and it has repair. And so Councilor Topaz brought up, with the issue of what's causing that sinkhole. Will there be more? Is it in a vulnerable area? So that is on a very, there is water coming off of that cliff, and there has been talk about taking some of that cliff away and doing some kind of work on that with that cliff.
Yeah.
So would this fall under that, under the implementation of what you just described as something that's flexible, and if there is a decision to have further conversation about that area there that is possibly and potentially a hazard or will cause problems. And second thing is that there would be a heck of a lot better line of sight in there too with that pushed back a little bit. And I think the city is in ownership of that property and of that right of way. So that's just my comment about that area.
So I think short answer again would be yes. We in that area, it's the most constrained in terms of the width of the available right-of-way and the obstructions on either side of the right-of-way with the basalt cliff and then also with the wastewater treatment plant. So the design we came up for that area reflects that level of constraint, and it's a pretty minimalist design. If you had more right-of-way to work with in there, then I think you could modify that design. I mean, if you had a lot more right-of-way to work with, you might end up wanting to do something that went a little bit outside the box in terms of what we illustrated here. You might want to actually go so far as to make some kind of amendment to the plan, which would certainly be possible as well. I think if you're going to propose a cross-section that's really different than what's in the plan, then you might want to look at an amendment to the plan. If you're looking at, we did actually in that cross-section identify some ranges of width of things, recognizing that even in that section, the right-of-way varies. And so we had kind of a range for the width of the pathway, and we had a range for the width of the kind of a partial landscaping strip. And you could easily kind of vary those things and still be totally consistent with this document. If you wanted to say add a bike lane, striped bike lane in the downhill direction, that's going to be a little different than what we showed. I don't see why you couldn't do that, and it would certainly make for a better facility if you were able to do that. So again, I think short answer is yes. I think if you made changes that were kind of change the basic configuration of the cross section, you might want to go back and update that section of the plan, and that's not a hard thing to do. It wouldn't take a ton of time and effort.
Yeah, out of that entire plan, looking at it, it's the only fish hook that I see. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
I thought I'd bring it up and
Yeah,
ask about it.
I think there's
I'm going to enlarge on that. Actually, right now at the bottom of the hill, we have bike lanes on both sides, and on a blind corner, you're bringing bike lanes from the riverside across. That's one dangerous spot. The other thing that seems philosophical is we're changing bike lanes from one side to the other, both sides, no sides. And for a safety point of view, we should have the same bike setup from Route 30 all the way downtown, not keep changing. The other thing, some of the assumptions I think that caused the plan, which are quite wrong. One, we do not have a definitive, and I mean a definitive, how many streets, where the streets are on the waterfront. And the picture you show is basically one block, cars, buildings, which has some real problems in it. When you take a look now, and now this is one of the philosophical things, you have a circle where we can either go to Old Portland Road or down to Plymouth Street. We've got to come up with, this is the way into St. Helens. This is our main way. Well, maybe you can go another way. No, mentally it should be one way, and this design does not carry that. The other thing, and this is now, we'll say, an attitude problem, we limited the height of the buildings in our waterfront because 20 families didn't want tall buildings on the waterfront. Tall buildings only 15 feet higher, and that blew away $20 million worth of permits. Now we have a small group of people who don't want that cliff wiped out, which again, we're now subjecting the city to the likes or dislikes of 20 or so people. The other thing we know is that sewer treatment plant is going to go away in the relatively near future, 20 or 30 years. And to say, well, you can't move the road because there are pipes over there, that's another design fault, now back to conceptual design, that shouldn't have been made. The other thing is, we're calling this a gateway, the connector. Coming off Route 30 on Gable Road, we either need to go over the railroad with a bridge, because going through that slot is definitely not welcoming. So we have problems of a non-welcoming entrance. We have inconsistencies of where the bikes and where the pathways are. We have spots where we haven't made a decision, this is the way into St. Helens. We have spots where a few people now control how things are done. It's not one of the things that gives me a warm feeling that, hey, this is St. Helens, we're really moving ahead. Basically, every 100 yards a neighborhood or something has limited us. We do not have a unitized thought from one end to the other.
So, I think, whoops, sorry, Kathy. I might be able to answer this a little bit because I had to get filled in because it was before me too, Mr. Councilor Topaz. Is that there's a gateway corridor that has already been done before us, even prior to getting here, that actually is Columbia Boulevard and St. Helens Street. It's already been drawn up, and I think this is in addition to future growth and like a loop that you would see Cannon Beach, and you have the main one that comes right into the town, and then you have one coming ingress and egress. Potentially this is the in and the gateway is the out, but the gateway is still going to be named the gateway. It's going to actually still highlight St. Helens. We're not trying to direct everybody towards this. This is just going to be one of potentially three, in my opinion, because I think Deer Island Street has potential too. So one of three, in my opinion. But this is the second one that we're completing right now. This, that may help you.
That does. Now, there's another problem that comes up about our industrial area. You have Port Avenue going straight across to where? Because all the streets east of the, or actually south of Old Portland Road have been deeded to the companies along the way. And if we're bringing in trucks to do our transfer, they get a bunch of corners to go around, or when we're trying to get the industrial area, the Armstrong Sealing Plant, the Port Avenue is very difficult to get through with your quick corners in Port Street. So that doesn't enhance our industrial growth in that area. And we want, or it's been proposed, that we put an RV park on the 18th Street circle area at Old Portland Road, right behind the wreck. And we're trying to get an industrial area back there. Again, for heavy traffic, it really chokes us off. We have a problem that our cost of power is high, and we have a problem with truck traffic. It's really is one of those emotional things that people aren't going to come. And some of this planning was started before those items were put on the table as assumptions.
I think through the process, and Jacob, you could answer this better, but I think through the process of what I followed is that this is actually designed for 18-wheelers all the way down to even the last turnabout, which is the narrowest, still will do a 40 or 50-footer, I think, single.
Yes,
single.
the
Is that correct?
one intersection that poses a challenge is at Old Portland Road in Plymouth, and the challenge would be if you are eastbound on Plymouth, and then you want to go, or no, excuse me, westbound on Plymouth, and then you want to go eastbound on Old Portland Road. But that would be an unlikely maneuver for trucks because they're already downtown. They're trying to get out. We spend a lot of time, and staff, we grilled these folks to make sure that the plan talks about truck traffic and acknowledges, because we didn't want to forget, we wanted to make sure it was embodied in the plan. And Scott Jensen on the port was one of the advisory committee people, and he was, as usual, adamant about protecting trucks.
The two things that were not basically on the table when this started was a possible ferry landing down on the waterfront someplace. We have a lot of places waterfront could eat up a lot of cars. The other is we're turning that lagoon into a repository for dirt. Even though the material is coming in by barge, the need for really heavy equipment coming up and down that road is very limited. You can get an 18-wheeler, and as Councilor Carlson pointed out, her husband, which is a good driver, can do it, no problem. I'm not worried about a good driver. I'm worried about the idiots. I'm also worried about the people, the RV drivers are not highly trained people. We have people running into the barriers on Route 30 and the Gable Road. And as somebody who's pushing safety hard, those are really tight spots that I find, very troubling.
What I heard you say, Matt, though, is a lot of this is amendable. I mean, if we come across an issue, we can amend it as we see fit. It's a basic concept of.
Yes. So I'll just say a couple of things in response to Councilor Topaz's comments. I mean, one, I would say that almost all the issues that he raised, other people raised during the design process. We had extensive conversations with our advisory committee, with the public about the designs. It's true that the design and the approach to, for instance, bicycle facilities does vary through the corridor in response to the conditions in the corridor, both the physical conditions and the character of the land use adjacent to it. So that was intentional. If you wanted to take a consistent approach throughout the corridor, that would be a different set of designs. But we were working with the conditions in the corridor and reviewing multiple options and multiple concepts with our group, and this is what we came up with. We're at, again, the adoption stage. If you all as a council want to recommend changes to it, those changes can be made. If there's a concern about specific intersection designs, for instance, some of those can be addressed during detailed design processes. Although, as Jacob said, we were very careful to make sure we could accommodate safely truck traffic through this corridor, and that is why we had Scott on the advisory committee to make sure we had a representative of the port looking at this and saying yes, from his perspective, it looks good. We made sure we designed those intersections, including the roundabouts for large trucks. So we did pay close attention to that. And again, there are segments where you could refine the designs in the future. But this is the design we came up with.
Taking people's property to make it wider and safer.
And that was the other thing we looked at. Yes, and some of those intersections, to make them larger would have impacts on individual property owners. And so that was another thing we were trying to balance, the location and the size of the intersections to avoid some of those impacts on their property and on the resulting, not just impacts to them, but cost to the city as well. So, we worked with the information we had, and this is what we've come up with, and it's probably not perfect, but it's kind of where we ended up. But
on one of the assumptions is to take no private property as compared to design a totally safe road.
I didn't say that. No, I think safety really was our first priority.
You've got some bad holes in your safety, but as I say, the first thing I would do, this is a totally safe, this is absolutely beautiful. Everything I want is in it. Okay, now after that, then I bring it into what I can afford. And I do not see that. I see we basically designing every 100 yards to accommodate, especially the Plymouth with no sidewalks and no bike paths on both sides because of that drop-off going into the private property. Putting a wall in there, we've got walls all over this town.
Well, Matt, I can only speak for myself, and I want the rest of the council to chime in here soon. But I think you guys have done a wonderful job. I would agree maybe a little bit with Councilor Topaz on the cliff down there. Maybe that could be adjusted a little bit with the line of sight, with Morton's input. I can see that on the fish hook there. But you've worked closely with our planning commission, with our planners, and I think you've done a wonderful job. I know ODOT's been involved at these meetings as well, and we have a stoplight coming out in Millard Road fairly soon. And that's been taken into account, and talking to the county and on some of their roads too. So that's just mine. So the rest of the council, I'd like you to also chime in a little bit.
Because
this isn't the deliberation, but
you touched on the part about Millard Crossing, which has been in the works for 5 years, talking about safety and getting a few more trucks off of that Gable Road intersection, because we all know that is just way too tight for the amount of truck traffic for that intersection. But I mean, the Millard Road crossing, we've been in talks with the port about other accesses that we can do with other vehicles. You had not just yourself, but a whole team of experts on this plan, from ODOT, from the port, from the county, Citizens Advisory Committee, our own internal experts on this plan.
a lot of outreach.
Yeah, a lot. The committee was, there was 10 people on this committee that, did this planning in addition to experts that went back at Kittleson that went back and did this plan. Anybody that's ever done development out here will tell you the rock is a force to be reckoned with. And sometimes, you have to choose your battles and get the best you can get, and you have to be safe, be safe. I mean, sure, you can blast and make everything flat and make all the roads straight, but is that why people live here? Is that a good use of our resources, a good use of our money to blast rocks away just because we want the road exactly where we want it, as opposed to 4 feet over? We have to make those good decisions, and that's why experts draw the maps, not elected officials. So, I mean, that's why you're hired. That's why we pay you, is to use your expertise to give us the highest quality plan. And, I've seen every step along the way, and you've made concessions here and you've made allowances here. But like we said, this is a conceptual drawing. It's not a build document. Situation can change from today to when we have the money to do this. Whole world can change. The economy can change. The community can change. This is just so that we do have plans, so that when the money does come, we actually have at least some kind of roadmap about where we want to go.
The money or the massive private project, which has its impacts that need to be mitigated.
Right. I mean, it's a long process. It's just this implementing this plan or adopting this plan does not mean it's going to happen even in my lifetime. You know, it means that we have a plan to allow, when we have this population doubles in this town, that there'll be a way for people to get out of downtown. And anybody that's experienced 4th of July down here will realize that having Plymouth Road upgraded to where people can get out in the event of emergency is a good idea. So that's just, anybody that's been down here when we had 6,000 people watching fireworks would tell you that making that road safe is a good thing.
Thank you.
One of the things that you've done very well, you put a line in the sand. We know where to be. We can change from here. Up until this time, we had no place to start from. And that you've done a good job at. There are discussions, but at least we have a place to start from. We've got a good 0 point, which we didn't have before.
Keith?
I like it.
Okay.
We can
Yeah.
change it anytime we want.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing
flexible.
all over town, all over different communities I'm traveling through, they're changing the way bikes are included in the community, the way pedestrians are included in the community. You know, right now, as it's been said many, many times in planning, a car is king in Columbia County. And until that element shifts, we have to allow for cars and bicycles where applicable. People start riding bikes more, you get an evener play, and you got to make that choice. And I mean, there's lots of places in Portland where they've had to add bikes. So
Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Jacob because he's got to get to the public part of this
There you
public
go.
hearing.
Okay. So, does anybody want to talk about it? He does. In favor or against? Okay, you're in the middle. Does anybody else want to talk? Okay, I'm just.
Neutral.
All right, Mr. Neutral.
Stay there, I'll just hold the thing. That's fine. Could you put up the money slide again? The intersections and the money slide. Frank Brandon.
Yeah.
Okay. So, representing the general public, as I am doing here this evening, one of the things we don't like is cost overruns. And with any municipal works projects, whatever, lots of times things are created that are budgeted for X and turn out to be 2 times X when they're done. Now, you've got all of these different segments up there, and if somebody said to you today, start tomorrow, maybe one of those gets done in the next 2 years, but all of them don't get done in the next 2 years. So my question to you is, with all of these, which adds up to a nice little chunk of change, as you said, what about the stuff that happens 10 years from now? These numbers are valid now, but if we're talking milk, if we're talking rents, if we're talking gasoline, if we're talking building intersections, in all likelihood, the price is going to go up. Is that up part in your 30% contingency? Or have you prioritized those? That, okay, we're doing this one first, and this is the last one, and the last one is going to be 10 years from now, and it's the last one on the list, that's a $1,968,000. That's what it's going to cost 10 years from now? So what I'm saying is, if all of this adds up to whatever it is, and I didn't add it up, but I'm sure you probably did, what, $40,000, $40 million, something like that? I don't know. Something like that. 10 years from now, when all of these intersections are done, is it going to be $40 million? Or is it going to be $60 million or $80 million? And the general public kind of wants to know how you arrived at those numbers, projecting the fact that it's all not going to happen at once. That's my question.
I can tell you what we do. So, in our transportation plan, just like this one, we have projects and we have numbers associated with those projects. For some recent developments, we're seeing some large developments in town, and those developments have required a traffic impact analysis. And the analysis basically says, okay, is our transportation system gonna not function as well as it should in certain places or not? And they've turned out pretty good, but there's one problem intersection, and I'm sure you all know which one it is, Gable US 30. So Legacy had an impact study that showed that intersection blowing up, and that's the term for it's not functioning well. And the apartment complex behind it, the same thing. And it just so happens that it is the right-hand turn, or the northbound turn, which is the problem in the PM, what they call the PM peak. So what we've done, and those are numbers from 2010. And it's a big number. Of course, these numbers are a lot bigger here. But we take that number, and so we don't make them fix the intersection because it's a small addition. But what we've done is we've required a fee in lieu of their proportion to the amount that it's blowing up. And so we take that fee from the transportation systems plan, and we add inflation, and there's a federal website where it's really easy to add the inflation. So it's in today's dollars. So then we have today's dollars to work out the equation. So that's, we can take that into account. Is it perfect? No, because technology changed and stuff like that. And what the problem is we can't work on these plans forever. You have to adopt it at some point, and it's a tool. Is it the best tool possible? I mean, if we had $1 million to make the plan, probably. But it gives us something, and as Matt said, it's planning level. So if the council said, well, dang it, we need to do the Plymouth 6th Street intersection. So the next step would be construction plans. And this is going to give us numbers to help budget, but we're going to have construction plans and stuff like that, which will refine it. But you got to start somewhere, and that's where we start.
Maybe I'll just reiterate a couple things Jacob said. One is that these are in 2019 dollars, so 10 years out, you would have to assume that they're going to be higher because there's going to be some kind of inflation, and we don't know what that's going to be. So we can't predict reasonably what the cost is going to be 10 years from now. We can only predict it in today's or estimate it in today's dollars. And as we both said, these are based on conceptual plans, and that's why the contingency is 30%. If these were based on actually preliminary engineering designs, we'd be showing a lower contingency, something more in the order of between 10 and 20%. But the higher contingency is a function in part of the fact that these are conceptual designs, and so that gives a little more wiggle room. And again, our goal is to avoid seeing cost overages or overruns or whatever, but we can't guarantee that won't happen. Certain materials can increase in cost a significant amount. There's back in the early aughts, the price of steel increased by like 2 times, and people who'd been out there estimating the construction cost of buildings that required steel were way off because that happened, and it's impossible for us to predict those kind of things. So, but this is, I think, a reasonable starting point.
And as pointed out early on, cost estimates weren't part of the scope. Yeah. So Kittleson was kind enough to do it because this is an important tool for us. And it's better to have something, so we're not starting from nothing. Any other comments from the public on this matter? Okay, I guess we don't need to rebut. Any more questions before we close the hearing?
Okay. Hearing's closed. Thank you, Matt.